Warning, this episode may contain disturbing content, soothing narration, and mild existential dread. Basically, murder ASMR for stressed professionals. Listener discretion is advised. Hell, it might be necessary.
Justice. We tend to think of justice as the verdict, the final answer, the end of the story. But for the Whiskey A Go-Go firebombing, the story didn't end when a jury found John Andrew Stuart and James Finch guilty in October of 1973. In many ways, that's where the next chapter begins. 15 people were dead and 2 men had been convicted of their murders. But for the victims' families and the survivors who would carry the physical and psychological scars of Brisbane's deadliest mass murder for the rest of their lives, a guilty verdict didn't necessarily bring peace. It certainly didn't bring closure. Those would remain elusive for decades. What happened after the trial would become just as important as everything that had led up to it. One man had refused to defend himself. Both insisted they had been framed. They claimed police had lied. They claimed the confession at the center of the prosecution's case wasn't real. And despite John Andrew Stuart's mental illness, his prison theatrics, his self-mutilation, and his seemingly endless stream of lies, those accusations found an audience. Over the years, enough questions accumulated to sway the court of public opinion. So was justice served in October of 1973? Or did the courts get part of the story right while missing the rest? Those questions would linger for decades, because it would take another 48 years before Queensland's courts would once again attempt to answer what really happened on the night the whiskey burned. This is part 7 of Foretold, Australia's Whiskey A Go-Go fire, right here on Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark city landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes to bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome back to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a fire protection engineer, former firefighter, and frankly, I'm just as shocked as you are that we are still talking about this case 7 weeks later. And spoiler alert, we're still not done.
And I'm not only shocked, I'm also aghast.
If you're new here, this case has some serious staying power, as in 7 weeks of episodes and counting. We strongly recommend starting with part 1, but if you want to jump in right here, we're not going to stop you. Just know that you'll be missing out on penis tattoos, amputated fingers, tactical tennis balls, kangaroo attacks, and enough bizarre twists to make you question whether any of this actually happened. But oh, it did. Either way, we are overjoyed that you're here, and we'd like to ask one small favor. If you are enjoying the show, please take a moment to leave us a 5-star rating in your favorite podcast player. Growing a podcast requires the patience of a saint, and thanks to my current hormonal situation, I have the patience of a toddler who skipped a nap. Thankfully, I'm also incredibly stubborn. But every rating and written review helps so much more than you know. As of the time that I wrote this script, we were hanging at 79 ratings on Apple Podcasts and 79 on Spotify. So please help us continue to push toward that 100 mark. I did see notifications that we got 2 more Apple Podcast written reviews this morning, but I got them after I wrote the script, so thank you to the people that wrote them. I will recognize you next week. Over on Spotify, Louie has been workshopping some band names and album titles inspired by our latest episode, which absolutely gives us the warm fuzzies. On Podbean, Sophie Brown and Just Becky, I too am an introvert, and I think we can all unite in our collective introversion. Jeff Luzier, thank you for appreciating my Papa Roach rewrite, and Kevin Tarrant, I always enjoy your thoughtful psychological breakdowns of our subjects. And Rena Grotke, we are thrilled to see you back in the comments again. Seriously, don't be shy. Leave us your thoughts. That engagement breathes life into my soul while I'm spending late nights untangling timelines instead of doing something wildly irresponsible, like getting enough sleep. I am proud to announce that I have officially made my triumphant return to social media. So if you see us on X, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, or TikTok, we would love your help. Like our posts, leave a comment, save them, share them with a friend. Anything that helps us convince the algorithm that me disappearing for a while was merely a brief artistic sabbatical and not a complete abandonment of my responsibilities. It helps a lot, and we're incredibly grateful to everyone who has shown up this week, and please don't stop. As always, Crime to Burn will remain free wherever you get your podcasts, supported by ads. But if you would prefer your episodes ad-free, we would love to have you join us over on Patreon. Members get ad-free episodes and exclusive sticker drops. In fact, our next sticker drop is still months away, and I'm already designing it because when inspiration strikes, you don't ask questions. You can find the link in the show notes. This week, we'd like to welcome our newest Inner Sanctum member, my dear friend, Beth Charis-Molling. Beth, welcome. We're honored you've chosen to join us in sharing the sacred snacks. And if you like to wear your questionable fascination with historical fires on your sleeve, literally, check out our Crime to Burn merch over on Spreadshop. That link is also in the show notes. Finally, no one has taken us up on our free sticker challenge. We offered free stickers in exchange for short social media videos telling people why they should listen to Crime to Burn, and apparently my marketing genius has yet to be fully appreciated, and that's okay. But if you change your mind, just send me an email and we'll make it happen. Until then, I'll just be over here quietly nursing my bruised ego. And finally, send us your case suggestions, episode feedback, fire stories, and favorite snack recipes to crimetoburn@gmail.com. Nothing lights up my gray matter quite like hearing from you. If I tried to recap this entire case, we would be here for several more weeks. But if you want every bizarre, twisted rabbit hole we simply don't have time to cover, I cannot recommend Jeff Plunkett's book, The Whiskey A Go-Go Massacre, Murder, Arson, and the Crime of the Century, highly enough. It was an invaluable resource in this series, and I can assure you that we still didn't plumb every rabbit hole that Jeff uncovered during his research. If you'd like the complete story, you'll find a link to his book in the show notes. Now, where did we leave off? Last week, James Finch and John Andrew Stuart stood trial for the Whiskey A Go-Go firebombing in Brisbane, Australia. Although both men were charged with 15 counts of murder, the trial focused on just one victim, Jennifer Denise Davey. And both men were ultimately convicted, but only one of them mounted a defense. John Andrew Stuart was busy swallowing his arts and crafts projects and couldn't be arsed to show up in court.
Arsed?
Couldn't be arsed means couldn't be bothered, didn't have the motivation, couldn't summon the effort. While he was given every opportunity to defend himself, he refused. Instead, after both men were convicted based largely on confessions police testified that they had made, they embarked on years of prison protests in an effort to convince the public that they had been framed. Stuart famously climbed up onto the roof of Bago Road Jail and staged a rooftop protest. Finch opted for the slightly less dramatic route of ripping one of his toenails off. Though, to be fair, Finch had previously amputated one of his own fingers to delay the committal hearing, so let's not give Stuart all of the credit for terrible ideas. As bizarre as their prison antics became, not everyone dismissed them as the desperate theatrics of convicted murderers. Because despite the verdicts, plenty of people had questions. Really big questions. Questions about the police investigation. Questions about the confessions. Questions about whether James Finch and John Andrew Stuart had actually received fair trials. And that's where we pick up the story today. Recall that after the fire, John Andrew Stuart voluntarily appeared for police questioning with a solicitor at his side. During that interview, he made something abundantly clear. He stated that he would never speak to police without a solicitor present. In fact, he went one step further. He said that if police ever produced a statement supposedly made by him without a solicitor present, it should be assumed to be false. Incidentally, the confession police later testified that Stuart made was allegedly given without a solicitor present. Stuart refused to sign it. Long before his trial ever began, he started writing letters and making public statements claiming that the confession had been entirely fabricated by police. That first interview, the one conducted with his solicitor present, had lasted more than 9 hours. The transcript filled page after page, and the statement Stuart signed that day contained no admission that he had planned or carried out the firebombing, and it bore his signature as well as that of his solicitor. Then there was James Finch. When police finally located Finch, after he went into hiding following the fire, they testified that he very quickly confessed to everything. No muss, no fuss, just basically, yes, I did it. The strange part wasn't that police claimed he confessed. The strange part was what came next, because the entire written record of Finch's interview was 5 pages long. 5 pages. I write longer scripts for this podcast. I've probably written longer grocery lists. Now, maybe everyone was just really eager to go home that day, but critics of the investigation couldn't help but wonder how someone allegedly confessing to one of Australia's worst mass murders could generate so little documentation. Where were the hours of follow-up questions, the attempts to reconcile his account with the statements that had already been given by witnesses? The detailed questions about where meetings occurred and how plans developed and who was present and where materials were obtained and what happened afterwards. The kinds of details investigators could use to corroborate a confession or maybe even find physical evidence. Instead, his statement was surprisingly brief. And just like Stuart, Finch refused to sign it. Police had an explanation for that. According to the officers who took the statement, Finch said that he simply never signed confessions as a matter of personal principle. According to their account, he told them something to the effect of, "I've never signed a confession and I'm not going to start now." There's just one problem with that explanation. James Finch had, in fact, signed statements that he'd given to police before, several of them. Finch himself insisted that he actually had no objection to signing statements that he had actually made. His objection, he said, was signing a statement that he claimed had been created out of thin air. Whether you believe Stuart and Finch or not, the inconsistencies became some of the earliest reasons that people began asking whether the confessions at the heart of the prosecution's case were as reliable as the jury had been led to believe. Also, it wasn't just the contents of the confessions that drew criticism. It was the circumstances under which police claimed they had obtained them. Recall that Stuart's first interview lasted more than 9 hours, and it only required 2 detectives to conduct. Plus, his solicitor was present the entire time, and every single word was carefully recorded and then transcribed onto the transcript. Finch's alleged confession looked very different. According to police, it took 6 senior detectives to interview him. 6. Yet, there was no independent witnesses present, there was no solicitor, and unlike Stuart's first interview, it wasn't recorded. And then there was Finch himself. James Finch had a speech impediment. He couldn't pronounce the TH sound. Instead of pronouncing the TH sound, he would pronounce them as Fs. So months became months.
Oh.
It was noticeable enough that people who knew him recognized it immediately. But curiously, these 6 detectives who testified that they heard Finch confess all stated that they never noticed any speech impediment. Critics would later wonder how 6 experienced detectives could spend hours interviewing a man, prepare a written statement based on his own words, and never notice something so distinctive about the way he spoke. And the questions didn't stop there. Because if police truly believed Finch had just confessed to carrying out one of Australia's worst mass murders, their investigation afterward was surprisingly limited. They never seized the clothing that he allegedly wore the night of the fire to examine it for traces of gasoline or other accelerants. They never documented whether they checked his arms for burns or singed hair. And although Finch violently resisted being fingerprinted after his arrest, which is a strange reaction for someone who supposedly just admitted to everything, police never adequately explained that contradiction. If he'd already confessed, why fight so hard over fingerprints? According to Finch's alleged statement, a taxi had picked him up shortly after the fire, but police never found the taxi driver. To be fair, they did make a public appeal asking anyone who might have picked up a fare in the area that night to come forward. But critics argued that if Finch had actually hailed a licensed taxi immediately following one of Brisbane's biggest crimes, there absolutely should have been a driver or a dispatch record or at the very least a witness who could corroborate that part of his story. But perhaps the biggest obstacle to accepting Finch's alleged confession wasn't found in the interview room. It came down to some landscaping and one man's inability to hold his bladder. According to Finch's alleged statement, he had hidden the gas cans that he used to light the fire in a landscaped area beside the Whiskey A Go-Go building earlier that evening. When it came time to light the fire, he supposedly rolled the cans, and he used the word rolled in his alleged confession, from that hiding place around to the club's entrance. The problem was that this landscaped area was surrounded by a low decorative fence. It wasn't tall enough to stop someone from stepping over it, but it wasn't designed for someone to casually roll 2 large gas cans across it. But that wasn't even the biggest problem, because at about the same time that Finch claimed he was retrieving those gas cans, a patron who had already left the club wandered into that exact landscaped area to relieve himself. Unfortunately for him, he had a bit too much to drink, and while answering nature's call, he lost his footing and fell over. If Finch was rolling gas cans out of the same landscaped area at that very moment, how did the men not see each other? And that wasn't the only witness whose observations conflicted with Finch's alleged confession. A street sweeper, whose name was also Stuart, but spelled Stewart, was working just outside the club that night. According to Finch's alleged statement, he arrived well before the fire, hid the gas cans, and then simply wandered around the streets for over an hour, quote, window shopping, until it was time to strike at 2:08 a.m. But the street sweeper never reported seeing Finch. In fact, he never reported seeing anyone loitering about the club during that period. Then there was the boarding house that was located across the street from the club. Ironically, this was the same boarding house whose repeated noise complaints had ultimately resulted in the Whiskey A Go-Go being ordered to bolt their windows shut in a misguided attempt to stop the noise complaints. On the night of the fire, residents reported hearing a car door slam followed by people shouting, "Get out of here." And to many critics, that sounded a lot more consistent with accomplices fleeing in a vehicle than Finch calmly standing around outside a burning nightclub hailing a taxi. Then there was one final piece of evidence. When Finch was taken to the temporary holding facility to be processed, fingerprinted, and photographed, 11 people occupied that room, which was a room measuring only about 12 square meters. That's roughly 129 square feet. So it was a very small room. Later, when Stuart was brought into that same room, police claimed that the two men exchanged very incriminating remarks. But that testimony was a little unusual. Because of the 11 people that were there, only 4 of them claimed to have heard that conversation. According to those 4 witnesses, who also happened to be 4 of the 6 officers that had interrogated Finch. Stuart asked Finch whether he had told police everything about the fire, and Finch allegedly replied that yeah, he had, but he didn't sign his statement. And Stuart supposedly became frustrated, asking why Finch had been so loose-lipped. The remarkable part wasn't just that only 4 people heard it, it was that all 4 recalled the conversation in almost exactly the same words, nearly verbatim. Interestingly, when the formal charges were read aloud in that same room, everyone in the room heard both Stuart and Finch claim that they were not guilty. And once they were imprisoned, both men began writing letters to journalists, politicians, their own family, anyone else who would listen to them, insisting that police had just fabricated the confessions and attributed them to the 2 men. Meanwhile, the 6 detectives who interviewed Finch remained adamant. Each took the witness stand at the trial and testified that Finch had confessed, and each signed the written statement. At the time, that seemed to settle the matter. But years later, Queensland would discover that corruption within its police force ran far deeper than almost anyone had imagined. And some of the officers connected to the whiskey investigation would once again find themselves under a very uncomfortable spotlight. But that spotlight wouldn't shine on Queensland police for years. In fact, it would be another 14 years after James Finch and John Andrew Stewart's alleged confessions before Queensland was forced to confront what had been happening inside its own police force. In 1987, a landmark judicial investigation known as the Fitzgerald Inquiry was established to investigate allegations of police misconduct and political corruption throughout Queensland. And what it uncovered was ugly. The inquiry exposed entrenched networks of bribery, illegal gambling, police protection rackets, corruption at the highest levels of government, and officers who weren't merely ignoring organized crime, but they were actually participating in it. Sound familiar? because protection rackets were exactly the kind of criminal enterprise that John Andrew Stuart had been talking about for years.
Did those corrupt police officers go to jail?
Some of them.
Nice.
Now, to be absolutely clear, the Fitzgerald Inquiry did not determine whether Stuart or Finch were guilty or innocent of the Whiskey A Go-Go firebombing, but it did fundamentally change the way people viewed police investigations from that era. One issue that was raised repeatedly during the inquiry was the practice of fabricating statements, or what was called verbaling. This was the allegation that police attributed statements to suspects that they had never actually made. And testimony during the inquiry showed that this wasn't simply an urban legend. Witnesses alleged that it had occurred multiple times throughout multiple investigations. And of the 6 detectives who had signed James Finch's alleged confession, 4 of them would be implicated during the Fitzgerald Inquiry. Roger Rogerson. He would eventually become perhaps the most infamous of them all, because long after the whiskey case, he was convicted of murder in connection with a drug deal and sentenced to life in prison. And even before that conviction, he had already been dismissed from the police service amid allegations that he had intentionally perverted the course of justice through bribery and attempts to interfere with evidence. Detectives Redmond, Atkinson, and Hayes were also named during the Fitzgerald Inquiry. Redmond faced allegations that he had deliberately overlooked criminal activity associated with Brisbane's brothels. Atkinson and Hayes were accused by other officers of fabricating interview records, allegations that both men denied. And the remaining 2 detectives who signed Finch's statement were Morey and Griffiths. Neither man was publicly identified by the Fitzgerald Inquiry as corrupt. However, Morey had worked closely with Rogerson, while Griffiths served under senior officers Tony Murphy and Glenn Hallahan, 2 of the central figures exposed by the inquiry. None of that proves that Finch's confession was fabricated, but it does explain why, years later, people began looking back at the Whiskey A Go-Go investigation with a far more skeptical eye than they had in 1973. When detectives connected to one of Australia's most controversial murder investigations later became entangled, either directly or through close professional association, in one of the largest police corruption scandals in Australian history, people naturally began asking some really difficult questions. Questions like, can we trust an alleged confession when 4 of the 6 detectives who signed it, roughly 2/3, were later named during the Fitzgerald Inquiry? And while the remaining 2 detectives were never publicly implicated, both had very close professional ties to officers who were. For many people, that was enough to cast a very long shadow over the reliability of Finch's alleged confession. Now, hang with me for a moment, because this is where the story gets complicated enough that it's easy to lose the plot. Remember Billy McCulkin, Mr. Tattooed Penis himself?
Who could forget that guy?
Billy was closely associated with John Andrew Stuart. These are the same 2 men who once orchestrated a workers' compensation fraud by literally beating each other up because apparently recovering from a friendly beatdown was preferable to getting an actual job. Billy McCulkin also moved in the orbit of what was known as the Clockwork Orange Gang. Exactly how deeply Billy himself was involved isn't entirely clear, but what is clear is that one of the gang's central figures, a man named Vince O'Dempsey, actually lived with McCulkin for a time, and Billy's house was widely described as the gathering place or the unofficial headquarters for members of the gang. The Clockwork Orange Gang, which included men like Vince O'Dempsey, Gary Shorty Dubois, and Tommy Hamilton, became heavily involved in extortion, arson, and nightclub protection rackets operating in Brisbane during the very era that the Fitzgerald Inquiry later exposed as being riddled with police corruption.
Well, let me ask you a very important question.
Mm-hmm.
Did they have bowler hats?
You know what? I don't know, but they did get their name from the movie. Now remember, Stuart wasn't just some distant acquaintance of Billy McCulkin. They were very close. And Billy was married to a woman named Barbara McCulkin, and together they had 2 daughters, Vicky and Leanne. Now, because Barbara lived in the same house where gang members frequently gathered, she inevitably became aware of at least some of what was happening around her. Then in January of 1974, just months after Stuart and Finch were convicted, Barbara and her 2 daughters simply vanished. One evening, the girls attended a birthday party on the street where they lived, while Barbara remained home sewing. The girls later returned home, and neighbors recalled seeing a car arrive at the McCulkin residence that night. Barbara, Vicky, and Leanne were never seen alive again. At first, investigators treated the disappearance as an entirely separate case. There was no publicly known connections to the Whiskey A Go-Go fire. And in 1980, a coronial inquest concluded that the three were presumed dead, and they tried to issue warrants charging Vince O'Dempsey and Gary Dubois with their murders. But the prosecution never moved forward. Years later, allegations surfaced that a prosecutor that was described as unusually close with members of Queensland's corrupt Rat Pack cops had actually blocked the charges. Whether that decision was influenced by corruption became one of many questions raised in the aftermath of the Fitzgerald Inquiry. Meanwhile, friends of Barbara McCulkin came forward with a remarkable claim. According to them, Barbara had separated from Billy and was trying to persuade police to move her and her daughters into protective custody. Why? Because they claimed Barbara had information about who was actually responsible for the Whiskey A Go-Go fire. Specifically, they alleged that she believed members of the Clockwork Orange gang had orchestrated the attack and intended for Stuart and Finch to shoulder the blame. But before any protection could be arranged, Barbara and both girls disappeared. And for decades, that investigation languished. Critics later alleged that corruption within Queensland's police force had compromised the case from the very beginning. But then, in 2016, the investigation into that disappearance was reopened and new witnesses came forward. And those witnesses alleged that Vince O'Dempsey and Gary Dubois had abducted and murdered Barbara, Vicky, and Leanne in an exceptionally brutal attack, all because Barbara knew too much about the Whiskey A Go-Go fire. Now, it's important to understand what those allegations did and did not mean. They did not necessarily suggest that John Andrew Stuart and James Finch were completely innocent. Instead, the theory that emerged was much more complicated. According to that view, Stuart and Finch may well have been involved in the conspiracy, but they were not the only participants. Rather, they had been positioned to absorb the blame, while other members of the conspiracy escaped prosecution altogether. Finally, in June of 2017, more than 43 years after Barbara, Vicky, and Leanne disappeared, Vincent O'Dempsey and Gary Dubois were convicted of their murders. The prosecution argued that the motive was simple: to silence Barbara McCulkin before she could reveal what she knew about the Whiskey A Go-Go fire and the involvement of members of the Clockwork Orange gang. The jury accepted that case and both men were convicted. And for the first time, a court had effectively accepted that Barbara McCulkin was killed, at least in substantial part, because of what she allegedly knew about this particular fire. So is your head spinning yet? Because mine is. So let's take a breath and put all of this together. First, there were enormous questions surrounding James Finch's alleged confession. Police made little effort to corroborate it with any actual physical evidence or independent witness testimony. In some instances, they appeared to simply just disregard any witness statements that conflicted with the version of events that they had laid out in Finch's alleged confession. Then came the Fitzgerald Inquiry. 4 of the 6 detectives who signed Finch's confession and later testified about it in court were named during Queensland's landmark corruption inquiry. That same inquiry uncovered allegations of fabricated confessions, officers accepting bribes, protection rackets, illegal gambling, prostitution rings, and widespread corruption throughout Queensland's police force. In other words, exactly the sort of criminal world that the Clockwork Orange gang had been operating within. Then the McCulkin murders added yet another layer. John Andrew Stewart's close associate Billy McCulkin was connected to the same criminal network, and Billy's wife Barbara and their daughters disappeared only months after Stuart and Finch were convicted. More than 4 decades later, a jury accepted the prosecution's case that Barbara was murdered because of what she allegedly knew about the Whiskey A Go-Go fire and those involved in planning it. So suddenly the possibility that Stuart and Finch had not been the only conspirators no longer seemed so far-fetched. When the Fitzgerald Inquiry concluded, public opinion shifted dramatically. Whether people believed Stuart and Finch were guilty or not almost became a secondary question. Many began asking something different. Had they received a fair trial? If police had fabricated the confessions, as the Fitzgerald Inquiry demonstrated had been alleged in other cases, could anyone have confidence in the convictions that rested so heavily on those statements? For John Andrew Stuart, those questions came far too late. He had died in prison years earlier. Officially, his death was attributed to natural causes, most likely an overwhelming infection. But his family always believed that he had been murdered to silence him. So could that have happened? Well, it's possible, but there's no evidence proving it. Given Stuart's long history of self-mutilation and the serious infections that those injuries could cause, it's equally plausible that he died exactly as official reports concluded. James Finch, however, was still alive and still in prison. He and Stuart had appealed their convictions 7 separate times without success. But after Fitzgerald, people began wondering whether perhaps those appeals deserved another look. Then came one more bombshell. According to press reports, one of the police officers who had allegedly been part of the team that interviewed Finch privately approached a journalist and claimed that the confession had been completely fabricated. According to that account, the statement had been intentionally kept vague because every additional detail created another opportunity for defense lawyers to expose inconsistencies. If true, the implication was staggering. The goal wasn't necessarily to create the perfect confession. The goal was simply to secure convictions in Queensland's worst mass murder without exposing a much larger criminal conspiracy. Now, was that allegation impossible to believe? Not entirely. Remember Brian Bolton, our eagle tattooed journalist? Weeks before the fire, Bolton had repeatedly warned Queensland police that John Stuart was predicting this nightclub fire, that a nightclub full of people would be firebombed. Detective Basil Hicks knew. But when no one seemed to be reacting, Bolton started reaching out to senior police officials himself. He would contact them, and each one would assure Bolton that they would run this warning up the chain of command. Yet every time Bolton followed up with the next level of leadership, they claimed no one had ever told them or brought this information to their attention. Could that simply have been bureaucratic incompetence? Absolutely. Or could those warnings have been intentionally buried to protect people involved in Brisbane's organized crime networks? Given everything later uncovered during the Fitzgerald Inquiry, the question suddenly became a lot harder to dismiss. Then, in 1988, after serving 15 years of a life sentence, James Finch was granted parole. The decision came amid intense public pressure from support campaigns known as the Friends of Finch. But there were conditions. Finch would be immediately deported to his native England. By then, he'd also undergone something of an image transformation. He had become deeply religious, began meeting with victims' families so that he could pray with them. And he even got married to one of his strongest supporters, a terminally ill woman who used a wheelchair. For many people, James Finch no longer looked like the man who had entered prison 15 years earlier. However, just weeks after his release and his return to England, James Finch did something no one expected. He went to the press, publicly, loudly, and claimed he was finally ready to tell the whole truth about the Whiskey A Go-Go fire, and what he said would throw this entire case into absolute chaos. And that's where we're going to pick up next week in the final chapter of our Whiskey A Go-Go series. We'll unpack James Finch's extraordinary confession. We'll examine the 2021 coronial inquest held nearly 50 years after the fire, and walk through what we believe is the most likely sequence of events based on every source, witness statement, court record, and investigation that we've covered during these past 8 weeks. So we'll see you next week for the conclusion of Foretold, Australia's Whiskey A Go-Go fire, right here on Crime to Burn. I think I sound pretty good. What do you think? Do you like the way I sound?
You sound amazing.
Am I turning you on?
Oh, yeah. I don't know what else you'd turn me.
That's a good point.
I like peanut butter.
I also like peanut butter. I got new flaming headbands yesterday.
You sure did.
And earrings. I'm a fire protection engineer. I can wear a flaming headband if I want.
You could if you weren't.
Probably a bottle floating around somewhere. We just don't know where it is. It'll just pop up. It'll pop up like an erection.
Boing, 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 boing.
I had to make 2 documents last night. A script and a timeline because things get real hairy from here.
Well, it was the 70s. Be like a cheese sandwich with no cheese.
Maybe we just get into it.
You got beef? You want to get into it?
No, I meant the episode.
It's definitely mammal sausage.
Those questions would linger.
Like a fart in a bathroom stall.
I'm impressed with everything you do.
Oh.
How did neither men see each other? Neither men see each other. How did neither man
How
notice...
did men neither either? How did neither men either men?
John Stuart and James Finch are both dead now.
Wah, wah. I gotta dig another hole? I'll burn your car. No matter how loving your bot is, it will never make you a baby.
A man in East China was sentenced to prison after authorities reviewed his electricity consumption. That investigation revealed that he was living with 300 pythons in his apartment.
Well, you can't just have one.
The 436 pythons were valued at more than 30 million yen, or about $4.2 million. I had no idea snakes could be that expensive. That's a lot of belts and shoes. It's too hot to be funny. It's hard to be funny when you're coping with swamp ass.
Yeah.
There's humidity under my titties. I've got under titty humidity.
Wow.
Yeah.
You got humidititties.
I got humidititties. But really, if you work out at home, why change into gym clothes that you're just going to have to wash? Just strip down to your skivvies, work out, and then you don't have to do more laundry. Maybe I can make a withdrawal later.
Maybe I can make a deposit. Banking is sexy.
I don't know, I met the people at our bank.
You're going to have to show me 2 forms of ID, baby. I think you know which 2 forms I'm talking about.
Do you have some biometric screening to confirm my identity?
I don't know about the eye, but I'll show you my D.
That was a cruel place to get a cramp.
That's always in the rib meat, man. Oh.
It has been on my to-do list for 9 months. So I was just gestating it.
If you notice, I didn't bother you about it every 6 months. You think anytime soon I'll be making an Excel spreadsheet?
I love Excel spreadsheets. I'm a freak in the spreadsheets.
I know that's true. I'm not really an Excel guy. I'm more a piece of paper guy.
Oh, but you know what we haven't told everyone this week is that the possum showed back up. Was that a 14-pound bag of cat food?
It's like a 20-pound bag or something.
Yeah, so I'm sitting on the couch and I hear this noise. And normally I know when the possum's outside because the cat is flipping out. Her tail's swishing and she's doing the little, how cats do that little chirpy noise. No, but she's just laying there. She's looking out the window, but she's not upset at all. But I hear this noise and I'm like, what is that? And I look out the window. There's a 20-pound bag of cat litter traveling across the front, or not cat litter, cat food. 20-pound bag of cat food traveling across the front yard in the jaws of a possum.
He thought he struck it rich.
He thought he hit the jackpot.
I was going to one of my favorite weekend places, but I had to grab a cigar on my way. On my way out of the cigar place, which is in a strip mall, with a Harbor Freight on one end and a real estate place on the other end. On my way out, I saw a deer in the parking lot. I was like, oh, that's unusual. But, we are kind of,
We've seen beavers in that parking lot. So.
Yeah. Not too strange, right? Except that it starts heading towards me and picking up speed. And I'm like, what's going on here? But it doesn't run right at me. It runs next to me into its own reflection on the real estate agent's window and just pop right into it and stuns it, and it kind of staggers around and heads off in the other direction and runs into the door of Harbor Freight and takes it off the track and then staggers out and almost gets hit by a van.
I have a very similar but had a much more tragic ending story. I wasn't there, but I used to do a lot of surveys where they would do hazmat and fire protection surveys for environmental protection facilities. So I worked with a lot of industrial hygienists, and they had all these horror stories of going into facilities, not government facilities, but industrial facilities, and how people weren't complying with hazmat requirements and hazmat disposal requirements. And so this woman that I worked with had been working with this industrial facility for years to get their hazmat disposal back in compliance. But for some reason, this giant industrial facility, which had acid dip tanks, had windows all along one wall of this room where they had dip tanks. And apparently a deer was being chased by something. I don't know if it was a hunter or a bear or what. The deer comes flying through the window into their facility and leaps into one of these acid tanks. And so she's going back to this facility to review their progress on fixing all of their problems. And she walks into the hazmat disposal area to make sure that all their drums and everything are labeled. And there's a drum that's labeled deer. And she was like, what is this? And so they told her the story about the deer that ran through the window and jumped in the tank. And because it was a hazmat, they had to dispose of it as a hazardous material. So they put the poor deer, who obviously succumbed to its extreme injuries.
They couldn't eat it at that point.
No, into the same kinds of 50-gallon drums that they used to dispose of the acid that the tank that the deer jumped in. And but now they couldn't get any of the disposal companies that they used to come and get it, so they weren't sure what to do with it.
They should put it on eBay.
So just have a 50-gallon drum of acid-soaked venison.
You just mount the whole barrel over someone's fireplace. Well, I can't be arsed to just stand here any longer. Okay, I'm starting to feel like a hostage.
Maybe we should give a warning about humidities.
Nah, let's let them be surprised. Go around a blind corner. Humidities!
I never understood the recommendation to use like baby powder or cornstarch to help with like...
Prevents chafing.
Excess body sweat. Yeah, but doesn't it just make a roux in your pants at some point?
I'd like to make a roux in your pants.
Like...
No.
I don't need my nether regions seasoned. I need them dried out.
I think you're using the wrong powder. You're not supposed to use Tony Chachere's. Yeah, AI says Tony Chachere's is not for personal hygiene.
Thank you, AI.
Did you vapor lock in your seat again?
Just fasten your seatbelts. We're bringing it in for a landing.
Skirt, skirt.
Crime to Burn is a production of Crime to Burn, LLC, where we light fires in your brain and not your buildings. All rights reserved. Still spiritually parched after this episode? It's okay. Steve believes in cross-pollination. Here's a trailer for a show we think deserves to infiltrate your ear holes in a good way. Don't forget to leave a 5-star review before you go. Steve is watching.
On the morning of July 31st, 2018, 25-year-old Dustin Duthie called 911. To report that he had murdered his girlfriend 6 days before and killed his parents just that very morning. Dustin's girlfriend was my niece, Taylor Toller. Join me, Kim, each Monday as I explore true crime cases with a focus on the victim and try to answer the question of how someone can make the choice to murder another human being. You can find my podcast, A Million Other Choices, wherever you listen to podcasts, including on YouTube.